Can you hear me at the back? Oh, that's better if I'm in front of this mic. But I'm mic'd up, so you should be able to hear me all over. If I step over here, you should be able to hear me. Okay. Scream if you can't hear me, because I'm a bit soft-spoken at the moment due to laryngitis or something. I don't know what it is. Anyway, as King Charles said when opening Parliament today, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to be back at Hillsdale. I was here, maybe 8 years ago, talking about Keynes and Hayek. And on the bill, it said that I was going to speak about Hayek, Keynes, which makes sense, I suppose, as we're in Hillsdale. And I see, even though my book is called Samuelson, Friedman, I'm billed as talking about Friedman, Samuelson. Just so that I know who to pander to, you know. I'm going to be light on Samuelson because, in a way, I think Friedman is a more interesting character, particularly in these times. These two guys were friends for almost the whole of their lives. They met when they were about 20 years old in Chicago University. Milton Friedman was 3 years older than Paul Samuelson, but Paul Samuelson was a child prodigy. He was 3 years younger than Milton. And they turned up at the same class at the same time, which showed how well in advance Paul Samuelson was in terms of his intellect. Paul Samuelson came from Gary, Indiana, not too far away from here. His father was a pharmacist, so he had nothing to do with the steel industry except by one remove. His father in those days, this is way before anybody thought of universal healthcare, or indeed healthcare at all. He used to be used, the pharmacist, as indeed in my childhood the pharmacist was used, as someone who could give advice while the doctor was too busy to see you, or if you couldn't afford the doctor. Milton Friedman was born and brought up in Brooklyn, then in the southern part of New Jersey. He lost his father very young and didn't have all the advantages that Paul Samuelson had. Not that Paul Samuelson had many advantages, but he won every scholarship he ever went into, so he was constantly funded, if not overfunded. Milton's wife, Rose Friedman, always held a grudge against Paul Samuelson, who she thought was sort of super-funded, super-entitled, because he'd done so well in life, and poor Milton was the underdog. Well, not that you could tell that from Milton, who was an immensely confident person. They met in the same class, as I say, because in those days, universities used to tell you where to sit. The opening class at Chicago had allocated seats for everybody in the lecture hall by alphabet, which put Milton Friedman next door to a woman called Rose. You got it? And that was the beginning of a love affair, which then lasted for 70 years. Although Paul Samuelson and Milton didn't have a love affair, they were very close to each other, even though they sharply disagreed, really from the get-go, about what happened. Their understanding of history, how the Great Depression took place, the causes of the Great Depression, ways out of the Depression, the role of government in steering an economy in order to make the world more prosperous or not, whether indeed it was possible at all to use the government as a means of changing the economy, or whether morally you should allow a government to alter and direct an economy. Chicago then was the beginning. Now, Chicago was one of the rare places where the economics department was entirely conservative. There were maybe 6 prominent people who stood the test of time, really. And there are very few universities in the United States, considering how many there are. It's pretty bizarre. George Mason is maybe another one that teaches not conventional Keynesian economics. But of course, they were starting off when Keynes was barely known. They were there right at the beginning of the Depression in the early 30s, 31, 32. This book that I've written, Samuelson Friedman, is really a sequel to Keynes' Hayek because it follows exactly the same logic that Keynes and Hayek followed. Hayek was an Austrian economist, so-called. He was literally an Austrian, came from Vienna. And he was a microeconomist who never really gave credit to John Maynard Keynes' revolution in 1936 with the general theory, when macroeconomics became the rage, and it's remained the rage ever since. In a way, economics is macroeconomics. Microeconomics is, well, still alive and going well in some places. But on the whole, if you want a job in a bank, you read macroeconomics. The reason that they disagreed was interesting. Paul Samuelson always put it down to the way that they understood what the Great Depression was about. Paul Samuelson had great empathy with his father's clients, the people who would go to the pharmacist to get their relatively cheap cures for whatever they were suffering from. Milton had a much tougher life, really. He pulled himself up by the bootstraps. His mother sold dry goods. We're talking about oats, sago, dried spaghetti, things like that. Anything that didn't need a refrigerator, she sold as a grocer, but it didn't bring him very much money. But it was made very clear to Milton very early on that he would be allowed to be educated as far as he could go, as long as he was self-funding. That put the two men, young men, at a great distance, really, from each other. Whereas Paul Samuelson, who was well-funded throughout, didn't need to work. In fact, he wouldn't apply for jobs, because if he got a job, it would deprive someone else who needed the money more than he did. Milton Friedman did everything in order to get enough money in order to pay for the school fees, for the books and the other things that he needed. Late in life, Paul Samuelson said that he thought that that was the profound difference, which displayed the difference between the two of them and their approach to economics and what it should attain. Paul Samuelson, like John Maynard Keynes, was appalled by the misery caused by the Great Depression. He thought it was unforgivable that millions should be thrown out of work through no fault of their own. And so when John Maynard Keynes came to the general theory, Paul Samuelson was absolutely in the right place, because Keynes too, although Keynes was very well provided for, both parents were academics, and they, at Cambridge University, he went to Eton, one of the great elite colleges in Britain, then went on to Cambridge himself, was a student at King's College, Cambridge, which is the most distinguished college of all those in Cambridge. This gave him a rather paternalistic view of what a government may achieve, really using the benefits of the state in order to try to give someone a leg up, if possible. But he was also a mighty intellect, Keynes, and so he found a way of explaining how you could actually effectively live in the future today. You could borrow from the future in order to put people back to work today. And that by spending money today, through what he called the multiplier effect, that was for every dollar you spend, it was passed on to someone else who spent it, who then passed to someone else who then spent it, and so on. Each dollar that a state invested in an economy was worth far more than that. So he found what he thought was a cheap way of getting people back to work. Milton was different. He thought that really you had to earn every penny. Best not to take credit. Best not for the government to get involved in things at all. He believed in the free market as a solution to everything. Paul Samuelson would say that there wasn't enough time for the free market to work. Although the market would work out eventually, he would say there's no point in an economist telling you that weeks after a storm has subsided that the ocean would be flat. You needed the ocean to be flat today or next week in order to be a benefit to anybody. Let's just see. Paul Samuelson, let's just fill him in and then we can get him out of the way. Excuse me. Because there's no real benefit much in going through Paul Samuelson's life, as it was a doddle throughout. He won a scholarship in Chicago. The only thing that the scholarship said was, you can take up a post somewhere else, but it may not be in the university you're in. So he was obliged to leave Chicago, which he thought was a great benefit, because that gave him a wider take on things. He took his doctorate at Harvard, and the dissertation, his doctoral dissertation, which Schumpeter, you may know, judged, said was beyond his means of judging because it was so beyond his understanding, but it was correct. So Samuelson became a doctor at Harvard, and he might have been expected to be taken then onto the faculty of Harvard, but instead he was offered a lowly lectureship. Well, this he didn't think much of at all. His doctoral thesis, it turned out, some years later, was the thing that was going to win him the Nobel Prize, and yet the economics department at Harvard didn't take his brilliance into account. So instead he walked across the Charles River and volunteered to teach at MIT, which in those days was a rather modest engineering college. He found out sometime later that it was the head of economics at Harvard, a WASP, who was anti-Semitic and would not credit Jews, however well they did, with the position that they deserved. It was not a meritocracy, and he never forgave Harvard for that. Instead, he happily transformed MIT from being a lowly engineering college into the powerhouse that it is today. MIT with a worldwide reputation, in its way every bit as important as Harvard. Now Milton, much more interesting case in a way. He went to a succession of universities which weren't part of the Ivy League. He went to Rutgers University, although in those days it was a private university. He did very well there. He then went on to Columbia. This is all very within the precincts, as you can imagine, of New York City. He didn't travel very far. And he got a succession of jobs now. In his 30s, he and Rose, they married relatively young, got a job together, applying the economic statistical measurements of an economy that Keynes had invented in the term of econometrics. And they did it for the New Deal. They were hired by the government in order to measure a whole succession of important measures by which you could tell whether there were any progress was being made out of the New Deal spending, the jobs being created by government spending, and so on. He gives credit to that, although he said it was ironic that he should, after all, do well out of the New Deal, as it wasn't really intended for him. But in many respects, of course, the New Deal was intended for anybody. Anybody who didn't have a job could be able to get a job. But for Milton, who didn't believe in government intervention, it was an ironic position to be in. Another thing that he did was to look carefully at the reasons for the Great Depression. It was John Maynard Keynes' point of view, and was the commonly held assumption for many, many years, for decades, that what had happened in the Depression was that there were too much money chasing too few stocks, which created a bubble, which then burst, bringing the whole world down with it. Milton and a woman called Anna Schwartz, who died about 5 years ago, set about looking at the details of the money supply during the key periods of the 20s and 30s, and came to the conclusion, surprising conclusion, that it wasn't too much money in the system, it was too little money in the system. If the government had lent money to the banks and kept them afloat, then the Great Depression need never have happened. This was a revolutionary thought, and was in many respects a Keynesian view of looking at things. If the state is going to hose money at banks in order to keep everybody afloat, that's exactly what John Maynard Keynes had been suggesting all along.